A is not the sound that this combination of letters makes in Greek. How is it supposed to sound? Why do I care? Why should you care? Let's find out together. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. So in discussing the pronunciation of an ancient language, it can be pretty useful to look at a modern language that is descended from it. So in this case, let's look at what standard modern Greek pronunciation does with this digraph, which is of epsilon and iota, or in modern Greek pronunciation, those letters are called epsilon and iota, but usually in English we just call them epsilon and iota. So together, they look a lot like E and I, and essentially that's what they are equivalent to. And in modern Greek, they only have the sound of E when you put them together. Separately, epsilon sounds like E, and iota sounds like I, but when you put them together, it's still just I. And right away, we can learn an important difference between a diphthong and a digraph. A diphthong, they both have the di in the beginning, which means dual, and the thong from thongos in ancient Greek, that means a sound, and in this case a vowel sound, and graph, that means something written. So a digraph has two written elements together, which make one sound. English has a lot of digraphs. For example, th is a really important digraph in English. Th doesn't sound like duh, it sounds like th. It makes a completely different sound. And that's the case with the modern Greek epsilon iota. It just makes a sound of I. But how did it sound in the past? How did it sound for ancient Greek? Ancient Greek goes from about 800 BC all the way till the early Byzantine or Eastern Empire times, so around the 6th century or so AD. So there's a lot of time in there, more than 1,000 years, to cover this language. So how was the pronunciation? How did it change? Well, the first attempts in the modern era to really understand that question come very famously from one of the greatest scholars and humanists in the whole Renaissance, who was Erasmus. And Erasmus of Rotterdam, he wrote this really entertaining dialogue between the Ursus, the bear, and the lion, and Leo, and they're chatting together about how Latin and Greek must have sounded in the past. And in his dialogue, De recta Latini Graecique Sermonis Pronunciatione, he discusses a lot of the things which are the foundation of how Latin and ancient Greek are normally pronounced in a lot of places around the world today, in a lot of schools. He got a lot of things absolutely right. For example, the observation that the letter C in Latin must always have just one basic pronunciation in the classical period, which is equivalent to the K sound, just a K sound. So cena for dinner, not cena as it is in the Italian ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin. Erasmus was right about lots of other things, such as with the ancient Greek letter that we call eta in English, ita in modern Greek, that it must have sounded like eta. It must have had a long e sound at some point in the history of Greek for a lot of reasons, including the comparison of transcriptions of Greek in Latin. So when it comes to the digraph epsilon iota, he says that, well, obviously it's not merely E, it must be the diphthong A, just as it is in Latin. And while this makes a lot of sense, and why one would expect, yeah, the way you write it should be the way it sounds, it's actually very normal for standardized written languages, even in ancient periods, not to have a one-to-one correspondence of letters with sounds. There are a lot of really well-known languages that aren't perfectly phonetic. English and French are really fantastic examples. In reality, English and French spelling conventions aren't lacking phonetics. They're just very complicated. In the case of English, we have an influence of a lot of different languages over a long period, along with a lot of internal evolutions, which has given us a really beautifully complex spelling system that's historical in nature primarily, as opposed to being just a pure one-to-one correspondence of sound with letter. There's nothing wrong with languages that do that, but practically speaking, there's pretty much no language, there's no European language I can think of for sure, that's written exactly how it sounds for every letter. There are little exceptions and little environments which cause different kinds of changes, and that's okay. A writing system isn't supposed to be a very precise way of representing every sound. It's a way to be a learnable, teachable convention in order to facilitate reading and writing. In linguistics, the phonetic way that we spell things is with the International Phonetic Alphabet, or with the IPA, and I'll be using a lot of IPA transcriptions throughout this video. You can find pretty much all of these IPA symbols on Wikipedia with little audios if you want to hear exactly how they sound. So while Erasmus was absolutely right about a lot of things, in fact, really most of what he talked about was pretty close, especially for Latin and to a degree for ancient Greek, he ignored something really important, which is Latin transcriptions of Greek words, or the usage of Greek words in Latin. A lot of them, for example, the word Nilus, the Nile. Well, that's spelled N-I-L-U-S, Nilus. And in ancient Greek, it's epsilon iota again. And that tells us right away that the way that the Romans heard it, as spoken by an ancient Greek person of their time period, which would be 1st century BC, earlier for sure as well, was nilus for Latin, nilos in the original ancient Greek. In Latin, Romans would usually use a corresponding normal Latin ending like us, and not the original Greek one, os, because they were equivalent. They didn't sound the same, they sounded different. They sounded like us and os, respectively. But it was more convenient most of the time in Latin just to retain the normal convention of how the declension works. So epsilon iota, when it's an ancient Greek word that's borrowed into Latin, is it always transcribed with the letter I, with E? Yes, it is, if a consonant follows. But if a vowel follows, there's something else that's going on. A fantastic example to look at is the city of Alexandrĩa. Well, how is this spelled in Latin? In ancient Roman Latin literature, it's spelled two ways. It's spelled Alexandrīa and Alexandrēa. It's spelled both ways. Well, in Latin, we like to look at classical Latin, and classical Latin means the literature from about 100 BC to about 200 AD. And the gold standard of all Latin literature is Cicero. Cicero lived in the 1st century BC. Well, how did he spell it? Different ways. He spells it 31 times Alexandrēa and 18 times Alexandrīa. And he spells it Alexandrīa with greater frequency in his later letters. And more than that, in all of that classical period, the spelling of Alexandrēa becomes less and less frequent, while Alexandrīa becomes more and more frequent as we go from 100 BC to 200 AD. This gives us the indication that probably the Romans are hearing Greeks pronouncing the word and trying to match their spelling system to meet that sound as closely as they can. Now, there exists the possibility that what they're hearing is something in between the classical Latin long e, which was an open e or a mid-e sound. I usually pronounce it as a mid-e sound when I use my classical Latin pronunciation, which means perhaps the epsilon iota was something like a high-close e or e sound, not quite e yet, but approaching it, and that's what they heard. No doubt it's going through that transition at least before vowels in ancient Greek. But what's really great is we have the confirmation of this in actual spelling errors of the exact same time period, where we see, of course, consistently before a vowel, all kinds of spelling confusions of epsilon iota with a plain old iota, which could stand for the long vowel. But in that same 1st century BC, we see with increasing frequency spelling errors of Greek speakers actually writing just a plain iota in something like Alexandrīa instead of Alexandrēa. So this is really beautiful. We have a very focused time period. We could even put it down to a group of decades where we have a high level of confidence that a lot of Greek speakers, and therefore a lot of Latin speakers who are imitating Greek speakers, are changing their pronunciation of the epsilon iota to consistently be the sound of E in all environments. And this is the pronunciation that I use in the Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek. The Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek is a sound system that my friend and colleague Raphael Torrigiano and I developed. And we developed it in order to be a sound system that could work for all of ancient Greek, not just the 5th century BC, not just biblical Greek, not just some other time period, whatever you want, but that could work practically for pretty much any time period. And one of the ways we were able to do that was to find a time period when we have all of these sounds transitioning from the more archaic to the more evolved, and then to find their midpoint, and that is approximately in this classical Roman period. It's important to remember that Greek and Latin are the Roman languages, both of them. Greece was part of the Roman Republic before classical Latin literature even begins. The Roman languages are both Latin and ancient Greek. So that's why myself being, I love Latin, obviously, but I love ancient Roman stuff and the history and the culture and the literature. And truly, these languages are so intertwined, they're just absolutely inseparable. And that's what makes them so interesting to study together. And that's why the Lucian pronunciation is a really great way to access literature absolutely from the classical Roman period, but also works as a practical convention for the earlier period. And in other videos, I'll show you exactly more why that is. But today let's talk more about the epsilon iota and how this sound changed before the classical Roman period. We see spelling errors in actual Greek writings of the epsilon iota confused with a simple iota, which would seem to suggest that it's closing from E into E already in the 4th century. BC, in the late 4th century for the most part, just becoming more and more frequent to the point where, of course, the Latin-speaking Romans never write epsilon iota before a consonant as anything other than just the vowel E. This is a long I sound. But before that, pretty much the entirety of the classical Attic period. And what's classical Attic? That's a great question. Why do people care about Attic? What's all this Attic? So classical Attic refers to the Greek spoken by Athenians who lived in Attica. That's the region in which Athens is located. Just like Sparta is in Lacedaemon, like the Spartan shield has that lambda on it, looks like an angle or something. And that's the Greek letter lambda, which represents the name of the Spartan country. Sparta is just the city. So the Athens region that it's in is called Attica. So we call it Attic Greek, the Attic dialect of Greek. We can be quite confident because of the lack of spelling errors prior that epsilon iota represents a single sound, and it doesn't have to have this allophonic, that is, changes its sound depending on different environments. So it doesn't have to have this allophonic change like we see in the Latin transcriptions, Nilus and Alexandrēa. If you're interested in understanding in greater detail the sound of ancient Greek in that classical Attic period, which a lot of people are very interested in, you can really find no better starting point than Vōcēs by Sidney Allen, who discusses a lot of the evidence in great detail, and I'm going to talk about a lot of this in future videos, so stay subscribed. So the literature, which contains the writings of Plato and of Aristophanes and all these great folks, classical Athenian or classical Attic dialect. And in that dialect, the epsilon iota only had one sound, which was E. And it wasn't A. Well, how do we know that? Well, we know that because almost all of the epsilon iota that we see in a normal ancient Greek text are a contraction of two epsilons put together. One epsilon is an E, another epsilon is E. You put them together, you get E. So that's it, E, a single flat sound, not A, not a diphthong, but simply E. And this is extremely frequent because the infinitive ending of most verbs in Greek is this combination, epsilon, iota, nu, and it, in that century, was pronounced in. Epsilon, which looks like a letter E in English, epsilon makes the sound E, as it does in modern Greek. You put two together, in. And yet, why is it written epsilon iota then? Well, one of the reasons is the spelling that we use with that epsilon iota isn't how they spelled it in the 5th century in Athens. They just spelled it with the letter epsilon, E, except it had more than one sound, actually had 3 sounds. That letter represented what we now write as eta, as well as epsilon iota and a simple epsilon. But because these 3 writings, these 3 graphs, if you will, which are a letter epsilon, epsilon iota, and eta, have 3 different sounds associated with them, a new spelling system was required. The writing system that we use for ancient Greek, and which is of course where modern Greek gets its spelling as well, is the Ionian system actually, not the Attic or Athenian system. And it had a lot of features which were very useful to the Athenians, namely an archon of Athens in 403, and his name is Euclid, but he's not Euclid the philosopher, he's a different Euclid. And let's talk about his name and how it's pronounced. Modern Greek pronunciation, Evklidis. But in the Lucian pronunciation, which represents that Roman classical period roughly of 100 BC to 200 AD, but of course as a convention can work for the whole span of ancient Greek by design, it is Euclides. But what is it in actually that archon's time and Euclid's time? How did he say his name? Almost certainly it was something more like Euclides. So the first epsilon iota is E, and the eta is E. We're going to talk more about that letter eta, E, in future videos. So this Euclid adopts the Ionian spelling reform, and that becomes the way that Greek is simply spelled there on out. So we can be completely certain that the 5th century BC, this classical Attic that everybody raves about, and for good reason, this is amazing literature, that no one there was saying A for epsilon iota. It simply was not happening. It wasn't a diphthong. But what about in the past? Well, kind of. There are, in fact, a lot of words that contain epsilon iota in the way that we spell ancient Greek to this day that were pronounced A in an archaic version of Greek. And two really salient examples are the word for if, which I pronounce E in the Lucian pronunciation, or pronounced A in 5th century BC classical Attic. Well, this epsilon iota, it definitely was A at some point in the past. And a great comparison is that some other dialects of ancient Greek that are contemporary with classical Attic Greek spell it alpha iota as I. So one I, another one as A. And another word is a word for you are, you singular are, which is E in the Lucian pronunciation, and it's A. The only difference between A if and A you are is that there is a falling pitch on the way to say you are. Whereas the word for if, it doesn't have a pitch of its own. It is a proclitic, so its accentuation is dependent on the word that it follows. So the word for you are, you singular are, A, was pronounced A at some point because it's the contraction of a word esi, where that sigma in the middle dropped out. It might have dropped out because, like the sound S between vowels in many languages, say modern Italian, French, or Portuguese, it became likely a Z sound, or in fact probably retracted Z sound. So it was probably esi, and then ezi, and then they just say like Z. They're like, we don't want that. So they say ei. So in an archaic form of Greek, absolutely, there is A as the sound of epsilon iota, but not for every instance of it as we write it today. And some words in that pre-classical archaic period would have actually had both sounds, both A and the long E sound, even though we spell them today both with epsilon iota. And a good example of that is the verb to have said, which is in Lucian pronunciation, ibin. In classical 5th century BC Attic, that would be ibin. But the archaic version would have had the first as a diphthong, ei, and the second as a long vowel, e. Ibin, ibin. That's a really interesting variety in the archaic sound of the language. But how archaic? Well, absolutely not 5th century BC Attic. Not at all, no way. And also not 6th century BC, the century that precedes classical. So Sappho and Aesop and Simonides and Anacreon are right out. None of the cool kids. You would have to go all the way back 200 years before classical Greek starts to the 7th century BC just to find someone who would be saying something like eibin. After that, all of the A, epsilon iota, merge with the long E sound. So it would just be eibin from the 6th century forward for that word and for every other word with that digraph. Well, what about Homeric Greek? Well, here's the thing. There kind of isn't a Homeric Greek. Not when it comes to a coherent pronunciation system. There's debate about the existence of Homer because we only have some records of him from people far after he lived who wrote about his life. The texts that are attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have an enormous amount of linguistic and philological evidence in them, which shows that at least parts of the story do seem to date back, even linguistically, as far back as Mycenaean times, as far back as the Bronze Age. Which makes sense because that's when the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey may have taken place if they're not just pure myth or legend. And since literature, meaning the actual writing down of stories, wasn't a thing yet, oral traditions of poetry, and that oral tradition being able to have something in song, because these were songs, there was melodies associated with them, they were either improvised or written down like sheet music. They're not preserved to us, unfortunately, but these poems are written as poems because they're just lyrics for these incredibly long songs. And just like it's easier to remember a song than it is to remember a speech, that's a great reason for why they were put into the form of verse. So these great tales changed throughout time. They were added onto by the next group of rhapsodes to take them and to spread them around and to teach them to other people. And so they went around the Greek islands, they went around the Greek dialects, and we can see evidence of the different group, the newest or more recent dialect, of rhapsodes, taking and modifying parts of it, updating it in order to meet that more modern language. But you can't do that everywhere because then it would wreck the music, it would wreck the rhythm. So some parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey are very archaic looking, and others are far more updated. For more on this, definitely read Horrocks' book because he talks about the whole history of the Greek language and has an excellent analysis of this exact and fascinating phenomenon of how the oral tradition of the Homeric epics must have been added onto and changed by the singers of them through the centuries. So if Homer was a real guy, he received these epics and he was one of the last people not to write it down, and that's the version that we got. Except it's not, because like I mentioned, the spelling system that we use isn't Homeric, it's not even Attic, it's basically early Koine pronunciation and spelling that applies to everything that we write in ancient Greek. Something like this happened for biblical Hebrew, by the way, where the language was updated for the new generation so that everybody could understand it, which is a very reasonable thing to do. And if you want to learn more about that, I can't more highly recommend the podcast Working for the Word by Andrew Case. Andrew and Bethany, fantastic husband and wife team, do something you might know. If you don't, you should definitely check them out. Aleph with Beth, they teach biblical Hebrew with comprehensible input. I absolutely love their series. You should subscribe to their channel. So to restore a voice that sounded something like Homer, you're going to have to make a lot of guesses, even when it comes to just figuring out how to pronounce epsilon iota. You can't just say, oh, it was definitely A before the classical period. No, some of them were A, others of them were E, and you'd have to systematically go through every single word with that combination, every single word in the Greek language that has epsilon iota, which is every other word, and figure out if it's supposed to be the long vowel E or the true diphthong A in that time period. But even then, you'd have to do a bunch of other changes in order to get close to the voice of Homer from Chios, and it just becomes an exercise almost in futility. That's maddening. As into ancient pronunciation as I am, I think that's too far. That's a little bit crazy for me, because you have to respell everything. We have a standard spelling for ancient Greek. You can't use the spelling as it is and base your pronunciation by just ascribing the certain letters to a certain sound. You'd have to memorize which words make which sounds, almost like you have to do for English. But you wouldn't be doing it based on a group of native speakers, like native speakers of English. You would be doing it entirely based on really just a whole lot of more reaching into the past. It just doesn't get to be very solid, which is why someone like, say, Sidney Allen recommends just pronouncing Homeric Greek like classical Attic Greek, because that's the people who were super appreciating it anyway, which were the classical Attic guys. And actually, I argue that all the classical Attic Greek, it really becomes the cornerstone of literature, including the Homeric epics, which preceded it by 300 years, because of the Romans, because of the Roman period, because of the incorporation of Greek culture and literature to become part of Roman literature as a whole. So that's why I think the Lucian pronunciation, which is a later sound of the language, is yet better for that reason if you're looking for some kind of historical connection. I am personally. And the problem then is if you want to go ahead and restore a few A where they are real and maybe even do other ancient Homeric things, that's just not the sound of classical Attic literature. It's not even the sound of most of ancient Greek literature, which is from the Koine period. Koine, by the way, in modern Greek that's pronounced Koine, in Lucian pronunciation it's Koine, and this means common in Greek. So Koine, it's a feminine noun talking about the dialektos, the dialect. But Attic Greek wasn't the only dialect of that classical period. There are many other contemporary dialects, and one of them is Boeotian. So after Euclid, Euclides, Euclides, after he brings in the spelling reform and adopts the Ionian alphabet, we get to observe a really fascinating phenomenon that's going on in a contemporary dialect of Greek, Boeotian, just north of Athens. Once the Ionian spelling reform took hold in Athens, we are now able to compare the spellings of the Boeotian dialect with standard Attic from Athens. And there we see that the Attic spellings that are alpha iota, I, the letter eta, e, long open e, and epsilon iota, which is the long closed e sound, are written like this. Alpha iota instead is written with the letter eta, the long open e sound, and that the eta is written with the epsilon iota, so it's actually e for all of those words that would normally have the letter eta in Attic, and that the Attic epsilon iota, which is e, the long closed e sound, is written with just a plain iota, e. So we see I has become e has become e, and e has become e. It's so interesting because Boeotian is showing how the pronunciation of Greek will change in Common Greek and Koine Greek in hundreds of years. It isn't contemporary with Attic. Those changes aren't in Attic, and the reason we know that classical Attic isn't pronounced that way is because these are spelled differently. Now I'm going to save a more detailed discussion about Boeotian in general and of the evolution of the sound of the letter eta and of the alpha iota for other videos, which is why you should subscribe and hit the little bell icon so that you're notified every time there's a new video from polýMATHY. Yay, I'm like every other YouTuber now, yay! Don't forget to like and share with your friends. So Boeotian already has e for epsilon iota, while classical Attic has e, although as soon as the classical Attic period is over, in the very beginning of Koine, it's going to close to e, which is great. Now, what you'll sometimes see are philologists from Greece who see that kind of spelling mistake in a non-Attic dialect, and they will say, "Aha!
There you go.
There you go.
There you go."
And assume since there was one spelling confusion in one place, it must have been general to the whole populace everywhere.
Of course.
And that's simply not true. It's certainly not true even for the Koine dialect of Greek, because as we already discussed, we can see how epsilon iota absolutely was in the pronunciation of Koine Greek up until the Roman period in front of consonants. Yeah, it was a closed E sound, but it was still A in front of vowels until the end of the 1st century BC. It doesn't mean pronouncing that particular digraph as E is non-historical, but it's part of a different sound system that's not classical Attic. So if you want to have a combination of sounds, the whole system to actually be historical, you'd have to do something else to make that work, and you might try to use a Boeotian sound, but doing that is dicey. Doing that requires a lot of complexity and a lot of really careful study. You can't just decide that you're going to pronounce a certain sound a certain way. For example, just deciding you're going to pronounce epsilon iota as a, and say, it was like that in the 7th century, so I'm going to do it for all ancient Greek, and assume that that works for the whole sound system of the language when it clearly does not. Boeotian does something else really cool, where the Attic spelling omicron iota, which would be pronounced oi in the classical period, is written as epsilon iota, as the e sound. And that indicates that a transformation something like this happened. Starting in a more archaic form of Boeotian, it was oi, and then we have the fronting of the o, which is a back vowel, into something more like ü, like schön in German. So then we have ui, and then we have the rounding of the second component of the e, where we round the lips around it to make ü, which is like the epsilon. So then we have ui, ui. This is, by the way, how I pronounce that vowel in Lucian pronunciation, because it does represent that transition really well. But just as far as Boeotian, oi to ui to ui, and then to a long u sound, u. Now u is just the rounded version of e. I will keep the inside of my mouth the same between these two vowels. I will just change the shape of my lips from u, e, u, e, u, e, u, e. So inside u, e, u, e, u, e, same shape. That's not changing at all. It's just the roundedness, how much the lips are rounded around it to make that different sound. So u, and then it becomes e. And rounding and unrounding of vowels is a really interesting phenomenon that happens in lots of languages as their vowels evolve through time. And Greek's no exception. In future videos, we'll show how vowels get rounded and unrounded and fronted and all sorts of really cool things, which leads from the archaic pronunciation of Greek all the way through the modern pronunciation of Greek. I want to talk a little bit about pronunciation wars and how they connect, because a lot of modern Greeks are even taught in school that Greek pronunciation has been exactly the same for thousands of years. And there are some aspects of modern Greek which are identical to ancient Greek in different time periods. But the fact that ancient Greek pronunciation has changed is simply a fact, because not only do all languages show some kind of linguistic change, but in the case of ancient Greek, we have wonderful, beautiful, and excellent testimony of a lot of the exact changes and when they happened. Just like we can see how the epsilon iota in the 1st century BC in front of vowels went from being A into E. On the other side are people outside of Greece, either people from Western Europe or who speak languages that are from Western Europe. And you can sense an attitude which has existed for a long time, which is somewhat dismissive of the modern pronunciation of Greek being used as a convention for ancient Greek. And like I've said in other videos, there is nothing wrong with a convention. A convention's a convention. Modern Greeks are able to study, enjoy, and appreciate ancient Greek through the modern Greek pronunciation. And the Erasmian pronunciation doesn't really bring that much to the table because one of the most important parts of the literature is phonemic vowel length, and Erasmian pronunciation, as applied by most people, doesn't take any account of that most critical feature. So if I'm not going to do that, then it seems really silly to me to say that Erasmian is inherently better or represents the sound of ancient Greek when its most critical factor, phonemic vowel length, isn't even being considered or applied effectively. In reality, people get way too concerned about the superficial aspects of pronunciation, which are the precise sound of the vowels or the precise sound of the consonants. When, again, that really critical factor is, well, what does that apply to the literature? Well, the literature is structured on phonemic vowel length off of interchanging long and short vowel sounds. I wrote a newsletter about this recently, and I'll put the link to that in the description so you can check out how I see that and why I think it's just so incredibly important to the pronunciation of ancient Greek and Latin conventionally, how we apply it. So we can use a pronunciation which sounds a lot like an American accent or an Italian accent or a German accent when we deal with these ancient languages, and still get a lot out of them, and I would say most out of them, even though maybe the consonants or the vowels qualities aren't ancient. Because as long as those quantities are there, then we're at least coinciding with the proper sound of the rhythm of the literature, the feature that forms its most basic structure. Greek speakers are kind of bitter when it comes to this topic, and I think it comes from generations of conflict between East and West. And as an American, I don't really sense this particularly, but I picked up on it living in Europe for a little bit, that it's a leftover from the Great Schism between the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Most people probably don't feel that way at all today when it comes to religious stuff. It's just one of those things that gets kind of stuck in the conscience, and it gets passed down in all kinds of subtle ways. And I can't really blame them. The Crusades ransacked Constantinople every 100 years or so. So, I mean, I get why they would kind of be bitter. The Middle Ages saw this conflict as something like the Eastern Romans, that is the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Romans being characterized as hedonistic and depraved, and the Western Europeans, the Latins, the Roman Catholics, being barbaric and uncivilized. And essentially they both heavily mischaracterized each other, which led to this long, deep-seated feeling of conflict. And that's not helped at all because in the modern time we have a majority of Greeks who look at ancient Greek and are taught that anyone who tells you that ancient Greek had a different pronunciation or whatever pronunciation they use, that Erasmian thing, is just barbarism and it is beneath dignity. And then you have people over in the West who say that anything about modern Greek pronunciation used in the ancient language is completely unacceptable. And that's an unacceptable schism because it doesn't have to be that way. And bringing these two worlds together is a big part of why Raphael Torrigiano and I developed the Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek. You should definitely check out the video that we did together, as well as lots and lots and lots of recordings I've made in the Lucian pronunciation of ancient Greek, and they're in the description of this video. But I would like to assuage Greeks who have this idea that Erasmus was some kind of anti-Catholic, therefore anti-ecclesiastical pronunciation, and anti-Eastern Orthodox, politically motivated fellow, that I don't know about Erasmus's political feelings with that in particular, based merely on his writings. Of course, he did have some opinions on these things, but it doesn't come through in that dialogue. Or more accurately, this was one of the greatest scholars who ever lived. He was absolutely interested in an historical reconstruction of the sound of both languages. Whether or not he actually used that practically or not is also an interesting question. But because of him, it led to this wonderful revolution in philology, particularly in Western Europe, to look at ancient Greek and to rediscover how it might have sounded and to see if there's anything we can learn about the ancient language if we pronounce it in an ancient way. And there is a lot, and that's what makes it really, really cool to explore, and that's why I'm fascinated by it. It's not the most important part about ancient Greek, but it is a really interesting part, and it's worth understanding, especially when we actually get to literature where it becomes a factor that's important. And if we use a convention that doesn't work for that ancient pronunciation, and when we see that, when we compare it with the actual literature, we can accept that and move on. And Erasmus got a lot of stuff right about the pronunciation of ancient Latin and ancient Greek. A just wasn't one of them when it comes to the diphthong of epsilon iota. And he can be forgiven. He didn't have access to the kind of data that we have. He didn't have the benefit of hundreds of years of scholarship to reveal that the classical Attic pronunciation of epsilon iota was E, and that thereafter, in the Koine period, it became E. He absolutely can be forgiven for that and admired for the attempt. What I have a problem with, and this is more my thing, is that Erasmian pronunciation is masquerading as an historical reconstruction of the sound of ancient Greek, and that's not true. It's not. Some aspects, absolutely. Some aspects are either not right for the time period. Other things are just not part of history, which this A, if you make every epsilon iota into A, that's not part of the sound of ancient Greek in history, except in the scholarship of the West in the past couple hundred years. It's just a convention, which is another problem with it. Erasmian is used so inconsistently, so painfully inconsistently. One example is that this very same epsilon iota is pronounced sometimes as I in German, along with alpha iota is also I. So that's an unfortunate merger. Another would be in Italy, the theta is pronounced as simply theta. They don't make that distinction because Italian doesn't have a th sound, so it makes sense for people speaking it, if they're not concerned with reciting this stuff and trying to communicate in it, to use a whatever conventional pronunciation to read it. It's fine. But to call that the ancient pronunciation of the language bothers me. It's not factual. If Erasmian were one consistent convention, then it would be a little bit easier to get behind, but because it's all over the place in so many different ways, which we'll explore in the future, it's like, But for that exact same reason, I think it's totally fine. If you use Erasmian, well, of course, number one of 20 things I've talked about today. Number one, it's totally fine for you, since you've already used Erasmian, probably a lot of you. Go ahead. I'm not against that. Go ahead, do that. You can be understood. It's fine. It's totally fine. You don't have to be historical to get a great use out of the language, right? You can use modern Greek pronunciation, which is even further away from the ancient pronunciation of ancient Greek than Erasmian is, and get huge amounts out of it. Pretty much everything you need. So continue to do what you're doing. But if you want to make a teensy-weensy little tweak to Erasmian, to at least make more of its sounds actually part of history, change the A sound that you're making into E. Or even go a little bit farther forward and make it E. You'll be in the same good company as Cicero and Caesar, and Virgil and Augustus for sure, to say nothing of Plutarch and Lucian. Then at least the digraph epsilon iota is a sound that the digraph has made in history, whether E or E, instead of nothing. Or don't change it. Stick with that Erasmian pronunciation. That's how you know the language. Keep it. Whatever convention you use, no matter how close it is to the letter or spirit of Erasmus or not, is how you interact with the ancient Greek language. And I want you to know that not only do I accept that, I respect that. A lot of you out there are just tremendous whizzes at ancient Greek. You're some of the best scholars I've ever met, some of you that may be watching this. You know who I'm talking to. Chiare fide. And comparatively, I'm just a novice when it comes to ancient Greek literature. And my communication, like this, about ancient Greek phonology, no matter how detailed, is not an attempt to devalue all of the things that you have achieved and mastered, because I stand in awe of what you have already done. And something else, and this is especially for our Filistina Lada, that you can see that there is a lot of complexity and some uncertainty in the reconstruction of the sound of ancient Greek, but that does not invalidate the pursuit of an ancient pronunciation, just because it's difficult doesn't mean we stop investigating. The modern pronunciation of Greek, as applied to ancient Greek, is not inherently more valid than a reconstructed ancient Greek pronunciation. They are all merely conventions with essentially the same purpose, and sometimes they have slightly different purposes. And to respond to some comments that I've heard from Greek speakers over the years, you have to know that our interest in ancient Greek is not something we're trying to take away from you. I have heard that a lot, that, oh, just barbarians trying to take away, our culture and our language. We're not trying to do that. We love it the same reason that you love it. And we're not using a different pronunciation system because we hate Greeks. Agopopoli, ketin alada, keta nealinika. By the way, the clickbaity thumbnail that looks like this at the moment, I used mostly to kind of make fun of myself in those other older videos where I had such a strong opinion, but I was kind of closed-minded to the idea that Erasmian or some version of Erasmian could be a convention, and that a convention is just a convention. It's just a way to access the language. But I never, ever intended to express anything critical of the people using it. Not at all. I'm only critical of books, of which there are so many. Here's one example. Oh my God, look at this nonsense. Which so frequently say that these totally incorrect things, when we've had the book for 50 years showing us exactly how ancient Greek sounded, at least in some time period, is really annoying. That's why I find it so... come on, stop saying that these things which are part of a convention are actually historical when they're not. The idea, though, that ei is the pronunciation of epsilon iota is part of the reason that the name of Poseidon is spelled that way. In Latin, it's just transcribed with a simple letter I, because, of course, in ancient Greek of that Roman time, it was simply Pοσειδῶn, so it's going to be an E sound, and not A or something like that. And long E from Latin very regularly become in English the sound I. That's why it's Poseidon, and not Poseidon, which is what we'd actually expect it to be, or even Poseidon or something in English pronunciation. Also true of Mars's moon, which in English we usually call Deimos. Calling this Demos or Deimos, probably Deimos, would be the most normal English way to do it, given the English great vowel shift. So in short, A, not a thing in the history of the pronunciation of ancient Greek, certainly not classical Greek to present. Doesn't make it a bad thing as a part of a convention, which is also not a bad thing. It's just not exactly a part of history, but that's okay. What do you feel about it? I just can't wait to read all of the comments. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you so much for listening and for subscribing and for sharing this video. This is a highly detailed video, very kind of, philological video, so really do share it with someone you think might enjoy it. That really helps the YouTube algorithm to share it with more people who otherwise wouldn't see it at all. So thanks again. Thanks above all to my Patreon supporters. You're the best. The Bronze Age, or the Bronze Age, bronze.